Welcome back to Holloway Archives, where we explore the darkest corners of forgotten America. Before we dive into today's haunting story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts across the country who appreciate these forgotten tales of isolation, family secrets, and the shadows that lurk in America's most remote places. Today's story is a work of fiction, but it's rooted in the very real phenomena of genetic isolation that has occurred throughout American history. This is the tale of the Blackwood family, and I must warn you, what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about the limits of human endurance and the consequences of complete isolation from the outside world. Deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where the mist clings to ancient peaks like the breath of ghosts, there existed a family whose very name became whispered legend among the scattered communities of Winston County, Alabama. The Blackwoods were not just another isolated mountain clan. They were a family that had deliberately severed themselves from the world so completely that when they were finally discovered in the spring of 1957, what emerged from their hidden valley would forever change our understanding of what isolation can do to the human spirit and body. This story begins not in 1957, but nearly 80 years earlier, in the winter of 1879, when a man named Isaiah Blackwood arrived in the uncharted wilderness of northern Alabama. Isaiah was running from something. The records are unclear about exactly what, but whispers spoke of a terrible crime in Tennessee, of blood on his hands and a family destroyed by his actions. He came with his pregnant wife, Rebecca, their 2 young daughters, and a determination to disappear completely from the civilized world. The land Isaiah chose was perfect for a man who wanted to vanish. Nestled in a valley so remote that even the Cherokee had avoided it, surrounded by treacherous cliffs and dense forests that seemed to swallow sound itself, the property was accessible only through a narrow mountain pass that could be easily missed by anyone not specifically looking for it. Here, Isaiah built not just a homestead but a fortress against the outside world. The first winter nearly killed them all. Rebecca died, giving birth to their 3rd daughter in the freezing cold of their hastily built cabin, leaving Isaiah alone with 3 young girls in the wilderness. But Isaiah was a man possessed by a vision, or perhaps by madness. Instead of seeking help from the nearest settlement, nearly 30 miles away through dangerous mountain terrain, he doubled down on his isolation. He taught his daughters that the outside world was corrupt, evil, a place where only suffering waited for pure souls like themselves. As the years passed and his daughters grew into women, Isaiah's grip on reality seemed to loosen. He began to see signs and omens in everything: the flight patterns of birds, the way shadows fell across his property, the sound of wind through the trees. He became convinced that his family had been chosen for something special, that their isolation was not punishment, but blessing. And when his eldest daughter, Miriam, reached the age of 16, Isaiah made a decision that would doom generations of Blackwoods to come. Rather than allow Miriam to seek a husband from the outside world, Isaiah declared that the family bloodline must remain pure, untainted by the corruption that existed beyond their valley. He arranged for Miriam to marry her own brother, Ezekiel, in a ceremony performed by Isaiah himself under a blood-red moon in the autumn of 1895. The other daughters protested, but Isaiah's word was law, enforced by the rifle he kept constantly at his side, and the absolute control he maintained over every aspect of their lives. The children born from this union were the first generation to show the subtle signs of what was to come. Small abnormalities, a slightly asymmetrical face here, an extra finger there, developmental delays that Isaiah dismissed as signs of their special nature. By the time the 2nd generation was born, in the early 1900s, the genetic damage was becoming more pronounced. Children were born with cleft palates, severe intellectual disabilities, and physical deformities that would have shocked the outside world. But there was no outside world for the Blackwoods. Isaiah had succeeded in creating a completely closed system, a genetic and social prison from which escape seemed impossible. When he died in 1912, leadership of the clan passed to his grandson Elijah, who had inherited not only his grandfather's paranoid worldview, but also his ruthless determination to maintain the family's isolation at any cost. Under Elijah's leadership, the practices established by Isaiah became not just tradition, but religious doctrine. Elijah preached that the outside world had been consumed by wickedness, that cities had fallen to disease and sin, that only the pure bloodline of the Blackwoods remained untainted. He enforced marriages between cousins, siblings, and even parents and children with an iron fist, justifying these unions as necessary to preserve their genetic purity. The children born in the 1920s and 1930s represented the third and fourth generations of intensive inbreeding, and the results were becoming catastrophic. By this time, it was rare for a child to be born without significant physical deformities. Clubfeet, severe intellectual disabilities, blindness, deafness, and facial abnormalities were the norm rather than the exception. Many children died within their first year of life, their tiny bodies unable to cope with the genetic burden they carried. Yet, somehow, life continued in the Hidden Valley. The Blackwoods developed their own methods of survival, their own ways of caring for family members with severe disabilities, their own language of grunts and gestures that allowed even the most intellectually impaired to communicate basic needs. They farmed the rocky soil with primitive tools, raised pigs and chickens, and lived in conditions that had changed little since the 1800s. The outside world occasionally intruded on their isolation. During the Great Depression, government surveyors mapping rural Alabama for New Deal programs came within a mile of the Blackwood property, but Elijah had prepared for such contingencies. Hidden watchtowers allowed him to spot intruders from miles away, and when necessary, he would take a small group of his most able-bodied men to discourage visitors with displays of armed hostility that sent even hardened mountain men fleeing back to civilization. World War II brought new challenges as military recruiters combed the backwoods looking for eligible young men. But the Blackwoods remained invisible to official records. Births, deaths, and marriages were never registered with any government authority. To the state of Alabama, the family simply didn't exist. This phantom status allowed them to avoid military service, taxation, and all other forms of government interference. But isolation exacted its toll in ways beyond the merely physical. By the 1940s, mental illness was rampant among family members. Severe depression, violent outbursts, and complete breaks with reality were common. Some family members would spend days or weeks in catatonic states, staring blankly at nothing while the family continued its daily routines around them. Others would suddenly fly into murderous rages, attacking their own relatives with whatever weapons they could find. Elijah himself was showing signs of the genetic damage that plagued his bloodline. By his 60th birthday, he was suffering from seizures, partial blindness, and periods of complete mental confusion. Yet he maintained his iron grip on family leadership through fear and violence, convincing his followers that any deviation from the established order would bring divine punishment down upon them all. It was into this nightmare world that Dr. James Harrington stumbled in April 1957. A young physician fresh out of medical school, Harrington had taken a position as a rural doctor in Winston County, partly out of idealism, and partly because it was the only job he could find. He had been called to attend to what he was told was a difficult childbirth at a remote mountain property, but nothing in his medical training had prepared him for what he would find. The journey to the Blackwood property was treacherous, even in broad daylight. The dirt road ended more than 2 miles from the actual homestead, forcing Harrington to hike through dense forest, along paths that seemed designed to confuse and discourage visitors. When he finally emerged into the Hidden Valley, what he saw made him question his own sanity. 3 ramshackle wooden buildings sat in, a clearing that reeked of human waste and decay. Pigs and chickens wandered freely among children who appeared to be suffering from severe malnutrition and genetic abnormalities. Adults with grotesquely distorted features watched his approach with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. And presiding over it all was Elijah Blackwood himself, a tall, skeletal figure with wild gray hair and eyes that held the glint of absolute madness. The young woman Harrington had been called to help was Martha Blackwood, 16 years old, and in the final stages of a labor that had been going on for nearly 3 days. She was both the daughter and niece of 2 different men in the family, her genetic heritage so tangled that determining her exact parentage was impossible. The baby she was trying to deliver was severely deformed, its tiny body twisted by genetic abnormalities that made survival impossible. As Harrington worked to save both mother and child, he became increasingly aware that he was being watched by dozens of family members who had gathered to observe this rare intrusion from the outside world. What struck him most was not their physical deformities, shocking as they were, but their behavior. They communicated in a combination of broken English and primitive gestures. They showed little emotion, even as Martha screamed in agony. and they treated the most severe disabilities as if they were completely normal. The baby died within hours of birth, its malformed heart unable to sustain life. Martha survived, but barely, and would require weeks of recovery. As Harrington prepared to leave, promising to return to check on his patient, Elijah pulled him aside for a conversation that would haunt the doctor for the rest of his life. "You've seen our shame," Elijah whispered, his breath reeking of decay and madness. "But you don't understand our glory. We are the chosen ones, the pure ones. The outside world has been consumed by wickedness, but we have remained faithful. Our children may appear strange to you, but they are blessed. They are the future of humanity." Harrington tried to argue, to explain the medical realities of inbreeding, but Elijah's eyes held the fanatical gleam of absolute conviction. This was not a man who could be reasoned with or educated. This was a man who had created his own reality and would defend it to the death. The drive back to town gave Harrington time to process what he had witnessed. As a doctor, he understood the genetic mechanisms that had produced the Blackwood's condition. As a human being, he was horrified by the suffering he had seen. But as a professional, he faced an ethical dilemma that would test his core beliefs about medicine, morality, and human rights. Over the following weeks, as Harrington made return visits to check on Martha's recovery, he began to document what he was seeing. He took careful notes on the family's medical conditions, their living circumstances, and their social structure. He estimated that approximately 35 people were living on the property, ranging in age from infants to elderly adults. Of these, he calculated that fewer than 10 could be considered even marginally normal by medical standards. The genetic damage was staggering in its severity and scope. Harrington observed cases of severe microcephaly, where individuals had heads no larger than oranges. He saw people with extra limbs, missing limbs, and limbs that had grown in impossible configurations. Cleft palates were so common that normal speech was rare. Many family members were completely blind, while others could see only light and shadow. But perhaps most disturbing were the cases of severe intellectual disability. Harrington estimated that roughly 70% of the family functioned at the level of young children or lower. Some could not speak at all, communicating only through grunts and primitive gestures. Others had the mental capacity of toddlers well into their adult years. A few showed signs of what appeared to be autism or other developmental disorders, though such conditions were poorly understood in 1957. Yet amid this sea of genetic devastation, Harrington began to notice something remarkable. Despite their physical and mental limitations, the Blackwoods had developed a functioning society. Those who were capable cared for those who were not. They had established routines and systems that allowed even the most severely disabled to contribute in some way to the family's survival. Children who could barely walk still helped tend the chickens. Adults who could not speak still participated in the harvest. Most surprising of all, some family members showed extraordinary abilities in specific areas. Samuel Blackwood, a 19-year-old with severe physical deformities and profound intellectual disability, could reproduce any melody he heard with perfect accuracy on a homemade banjo. Rebecca Blackwood, blind since birth and unable to care for herself in most ways, could identify the emotional state of any family member simply by touching their hand. These anomalies fascinated Harrington from a medical perspective, but they also complicated his growing conviction that the family needed outside intervention. How could he justify breaking up a community that, despite its problems, had found ways to care for its most vulnerable members? How could he condemn practices that, while medically disastrous, were maintained out of genuine religious conviction rather than malice? The answer came in the form of young Martha herself. As she recovered from childbirth and grew stronger, she began to ask Harrington questions about the outside world. She wanted to know about other families, other ways of living, other possibilities for her life. And as her curiosity grew, so did her horror at understanding what her family had become. "Are there really families where children aren't born twisted?" she asked during one of Harrington's visits. "Are there places where brothers don't marry sisters? Are there people who can read and write and think about more than just surviving each day?" These questions broke Harrington's heart, but they also gave him the motivation he needed to act. Martha represented hope, a young woman intelligent enough to understand her situation and brave enough to want something different. If he could save no one else, perhaps he could save her. But Harrington also knew that any intervention would have to be carefully planned. Elijah ruled the family through a combination of religious authority and physical intimidation. He was known to beat family members who questioned his decisions, and there were whispered stories of relatives who had disappeared entirely after expressing doubts about the family's way of life. In June 1957, Harrington approached Dr. Walter Thompson, a geneticist at the University of Alabama who specialized in hereditary disorders. Thompson was initially skeptical of Harrington's reports. The conditions described seemed too extreme to be credible. But when Harrington provided photographic evidence and detailed medical records, Thompson's skepticism turned to professional fascination. "Represents one of the most severe cases of genetic isolation ever documented in North America," Thompson told Harrington. "From a scientific perspective, the family is invaluable. They provide a natural experiment in the effects of extreme inbreeding that could contribute significantly to our understanding of human genetics. But from a humanitarian perspective, the situation is unconscionable. These people are suffering terribly, and their children will suffer even more." Together, the two doctors developed a plan for intervention. They would return to the Blackwood property under the guise of providing medical care, but their real goal would be to document the family's condition thoroughly and explore possibilities for gradual integration with the outside world. They knew that any attempt at forced intervention would likely result in violence, so they would have to proceed carefully and patiently. Their first joint visit in July 1957 was met with intense suspicion from Elijah, who seemed to sense that these men represented a threat to his authority. But Martha's continued health problems provided a pretext for ongoing medical care, and gradually, the doctors were able to establish a foothold within the family's closed world. What they found during their subsequent visits exceeded even their worst expectations. The living conditions were appalling. No running water, no electricity, no sanitation systems worthy of the name. The family's diet consisted mainly of cornmeal, potatoes, and occasional meat from their livestock. Malnutrition was endemic, exacerbating the genetic problems that already plagued every family member. Medical conditions that could have been easily treated were left to fester and worsen. Thompson observed cases of severe dental disease that had progressed to life-threatening infections. Broken bones had healed improperly, leaving family members permanently disabled. Simple bacterial infections have become chronic conditions that sapped the strength and health of already vulnerable individuals. But the psychological damage was perhaps even more severe than the physical problems. Many family members showed signs of severe depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues. Some engaged in self-harm, repeatedly banging their heads against walls or cutting themselves with whatever sharp objects they could find. Others withdrew completely from human contact, spending their days curled in dark corners like wounded animals. The social structure of the family was maintained through a complex system of fear, dependency, and religious indoctrination. Elijah preached constantly about the evils of the outside world, describing cities as places of disease and corruption where good people went to die. He told stories of family members who had left in previous generations and met horrible fates, though whether these stories had any basis in reality was unclear. Children were taught from infancy that their physical abnormalities were marks of divine favor, signs that they had been chosen by God for a special purpose. They were told that normal people were actually inferior, corrupted by their contact with the sinful outside world. This indoctrination was so complete that many family members genuinely believed that their suffering was a blessing rather than a curse. As Thompson and Harrington continued their visits throughout the summer and fall of 1957, they began to build relationships with individual family members. They discovered that beneath the layers of indoctrination and fear, many of the Blackwoods harbored deep doubts about their way of life. They had questions about the outside world, dreams of different possibilities, and growing awareness that their suffering was not inevitable or divinely ordained. Martha became their primary ally within the family. Her intelligence and curiosity made her a natural leader among the younger generation, and her status as a new mother gave her additional credibility with the older women. She began to speak quietly with her cousins and siblings about the possibility of change, planting seeds of doubt about Elijah's absolute authority. The crisis that would ultimately break the family's isolation came in November 1957, when a severe winter storm struck the region. The Blackwood property, already marginal for human habitation, became completely cut off from the outside world as snow and ice blocked the already treacherous mountain paths. The family's food, supplies, never adequate, began to run dangerously low. Worse yet, the extreme cold proved deadly for several of the most vulnerable family members. 2 elderly adults died of exposure in their poorly heated cabins. An infant born just weeks earlier succumbed to pneumonia that could have been easily treated with proper medical care. Most tragically, a 7-year-old boy with severe intellectual disabilities wandered away from the main buildings during a blizzard and was found dead the next morning, frozen solid in a snowdrift. When the weather finally broke in late November, Harrington and Thompson made an emergency visit to the property and found conditions that shocked even their experienced eyes. The survivors were weak from hunger and cold, and several showed signs of frostbite and other cold-related injuries. The deaths had traumatized the family, particularly the children, who had never before seen such clear evidence that their way of life could be a matter of life and death. For the first time, Elijah's authority seemed to waver. Family members began to openly question whether their isolation was truly blessed by God, or whether it was instead a curse that was slowly killing them all. Martha seized this moment of doubt to make an unprecedented proposal. She wanted to leave the property and seek medical care in the outside world, and she wanted other young family members to come with her. The confrontation between Martha and Elijah that followed was unlike anything the family had ever witnessed. For hours they argued in front of the assembled clan while Thompson and Harrington watched nervously, ready to flee if violence erupted. Martha spoke passionately about the possibilities she had learned existed beyond their valley, hospitals that could treat their medical conditions, schools that could teach their children to read and write, communities where they could live without fear of genetic abnormalities in future generations. Elijah responded with all the fury of a man whose entire worldview was under attack. He called Martha a traitor and a fool, predicted that she would die horribly if she left the safety of their valley, and threatened to disown her entirely if she persisted in her rebellion. But for the first time in decades, his words fell on skeptical ears. The recent deaths had shaken the family's faith in his leadership, and Martha's arguments had awakened possibilities they had never before dared to imagine. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was resolved by an unexpected intervention. Sarah Blackwood, Elijah's own sister and one of the oldest surviving members of the family, stepped forward to support Martha's position. Sarah had always been one of Elijah's most loyal followers, but the death of her grandson in the blizzard had broken something fundamental in her belief system. "I have watched our children die for too long," Sarah declared in a voice that shook with emotion. "I have pretended that their suffering was holy, that their pain was blessed, that their deaths were part of God's plan. But no God would want children to freeze to death in the snow while help waits just beyond our mountains. If Martha wants to seek healing in the outside world, then I say she should go with my blessing." Sarah's defection marked the beginning of the end for Elijah's absolute authority. Over the following days, other family members began to express support for Martha's plan. The younger generation in particular showed enthusiasm for the possibility of leaving their isolated valley and experiencing the wider world. But Elijah was not prepared to surrender without a fight. In December 1957, he made a final, desperate attempt to maintain control by gathering his most loyal followers and threatening to use force against anyone who tried to leave. He barricaded himself and about a dozen family members in the main cabin, armed with hunting rifles and homemade weapons, and declared that he would kill anyone who tried to abandon their sacred mission. This threat of violence finally prompted Thompson and Harrington to involve outside authorities. They contacted the Winston County Sheriff's Department and explained the situation, though they were careful to present it as a case of isolated mountain folk in need of assistance, rather than a medical curiosity or freak show. Sheriff Thomas Walsh, an experienced lawman who had dealt with dangerous mountain feuds before, approached the situation with a combination of caution and compassion. Rather than attempting to storm the barricaded cabin, he established a perimeter around the property and began negotiations with Elijah through intermediaries. The standoff lasted for nearly a week, during which time the family members not under Elijah's direct control were evacuated to safety. Martha and 15 other Blackwoods, mostly younger people, were taken to a hospital in Birmingham where they could receive proper medical care for the first time in their lives. The culture shock was enormous. These people had never seen electric lights, automobiles, or buildings taller than 2 stories. They had never encountered people outside their own family, never heard radio broadcasts or seen newspapers, never imagined that such things as cities or governments existed. Many were initially terrified, convinced that they had been taken to the hellish outside world that Elijah had always warned them about. But gradually, as they received medical treatment and began to understand that they were safe, their terror gave way to wonder and curiosity. Martha, in particular, showed remarkable adaptability. Despite her limited education and severe social isolation, she possessed a keen intelligence that allowed her to quickly grasp concepts that had been completely foreign to her just days earlier. The medical examinations conducted on the evacuated Blackwoods provided Thompson with the comprehensive data he needed to document their case scientifically. The results were even more dramatic than he had anticipated. Nearly every individual showed evidence of severe genetic abnormalities resulting from generations of inbreeding. The level of homozygosity, genetic similarity between parents, was higher than had ever been recorded in a human population. Yet the examinations also revealed the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Despite their physical limitations and social isolation, many of the Blackwoods showed unexpected strengths and abilities. Some demonstrated artistic talents that had never been recognized or nurtured. Others showed remarkable emotional intelligence and capacity for human connection once they were given the opportunity to interact with people outside their immediate family. Meanwhile, back on the mountain, the standoff with Elijah continued. Sheriff Walsh maintained his patient approach, allowing food and medical supplies to reach the barricaded cabin while keeping up a steady dialogue with the family patriarch. Gradually, Elijah's remaining followers began to lose faith in his leadership. The promised divine intervention never materialized, and the outside authorities showed no signs of the evil corruption that Elijah had always predicted. One by one, family members began to surrender and join their relatives in the outside world. By January 1958, only Elijah himself and two of his most devoted followers remained barricaded in the cabin, and even they were beginning to show signs of wavering resolve. The end came not with violence, but with exhaustion and defeat. In February 1958, Elijah finally emerged from his stronghold, a broken old man who had lost everything he had spent his life defending. His empire of isolation had crumbled, his authority had been rejected, and his vision of genetic purity had been revealed as a nightmare of suffering and death. Elijah was taken into custody, though charges were ultimately never filed against him. Mental health professionals who examined him concluded that he was suffering from severe delusions and was not competent to stand trial. He spent his remaining years in a state mental institution, never fully accepting that his lifetime of beliefs had been tragically wrong. The Blackwood property was abandoned, left to slowly return to the wilderness that had always surrounded it. The buildings fell into decay, the cleared fields grew over with weeds and young trees, and within a few years there was little evidence that a family had ever lived in that hidden valley. But the legacy of the Blackwoods lived on in other ways. The family members who had been evacuated faced a long and difficult process of integration into modern society. Many required years of medical treatment to address their physical problems. All needed extensive education and social support to learn basic skills that most people take for granted. Martha proved to be one of the most successful at adapting to life in the outside world. Despite her limited education and significant physical disabilities, she demonstrated remarkable determination and intelligence. She learned to read and write, mastered basic mathematics, and even developed job skills that allowed her to support herself independently. In 1965, 8 years after her rescue from the mountain, Martha gave an interview to a medical journal about her experiences. Her words provide a haunting testament to the human cost of the Blackwoods, isolation. For 16 years, I believed that the world beyond our valley was evil and corrupt. I was taught that our suffering was holy, that our deformities were marks of divine favor, that our isolation was blessed by God. I never questioned these teachings because I knew nothing else was possible. When Dr. Harrington first came to our property, I was terrified of him. He represented everything I had been taught to fear about the outside world. But as I got to know him, I began to realize that he was kind and caring in ways that I had never experienced within my own family. He treated my medical conditions not as signs of blessing, but as problems that could be solved. He spoke to me not as a divinely chosen victim, but as a human being worthy of respect and care. The hardest part of leaving the mountain was not the fear of the unknown, but the guilt of abandoning family members who were too damaged or too indoctrinated to save themselves. I knew that by leaving, I was condemning them to continue living in conditions that were slowly killing them. But I also knew that I could not save anyone else if I did not first save myself. Now, 8 years later, I understand how lucky I was to escape when I did. I have seen doctors heal conditions that my family believed were incurable. I have learned to read books that opened worlds I never knew existed. I have met people whose kindness and compassion put to shame everything I was taught about the evil nature of outsiders. But I also carry scars that will never fully heal. I dream often of family members who died needlessly, who suffered without hope, who lived and died in ignorance of possibilities that existed just beyond our mountains. I think about children who might have been born healthy if their parents had been allowed to marry outside the family. I grieve for talents that were never discovered, for minds that were never educated, for lives that were wasted in service to beliefs that were fundamentally wrong. I do not hate my grandfather Elijah or the other family elders who maintained our isolation. They were victims of the same system that trapped us all, prisoners of beliefs that had been passed down through generations without question. But I do hope that our story might serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to isolate themselves from the wider human community. We are all part of the same human family, and we all benefit from the diversity and richness that comes from connection with others. Isolation, whether physical, social, or genetic, ultimately leads to suffering and death. Only by remaining open to the wider world can we hope to achieve our full potential as human beings. Thompson's scientific study of the Blackwood family was published in 1962 and became a landmark work in the field of human genetics. The paper, titled Multi-Generational Effects of Consanguinity in an Isolated Human Population, provided unprecedented documentation of the genetic consequences of extreme inbreeding. The study revealed several important findings that advanced scientific understanding of human genetics. The rate of genetic abnormalities increased exponentially with each generation of inbreeding. Certain rare genetic conditions appeared in the Blackwood family that had never before been documented in the scientific literature. The combination of genetic isolation and environmental deprivation produced effects that were more severe than either factor alone. Some individuals showed remarkable compensation abilities, developing enhanced skills in certain areas despite severe disabilities in others. The psychological effects of isolation and indoctrination were as devastating as the physical effects of genetic abnormalities. But Thompson was careful to emphasize that the scientific value of the case should not overshadow. In his conclusions, he wrote, "The Blackwood family represents a unique window into the effects of genetic isolation on human populations. The data collected from this case has contributed significantly to our understanding of hereditary disease, genetic counseling, and the importance of genetic diversity in human populations." However, we must never forget that behind these scientific findings were real people who suffered tremendously as a result of circumstances largely beyond their control. The physical pain, emotional anguish, and wasted human potential represented by this case serve as a powerful reminder of why genetic counseling and public health education are so important. The tragedy of the Blackwoods is not just that they suffered, but that their suffering was preventable. With proper education about the risks of consanguineous marriage, with access to medical care and social services, with connection to the broader human community, much of their pain could have been avoided. As we study cases like this, we must remember that our goal is not simply to satisfy scientific curiosity, but to prevent such tragedies from occurring in the future. The Blackwoods story should serve as both a scientific resource and a moral imperative to ensure that no other family endures such unnecessary suffering. The legacy of the Blackwood family extended far beyond the scientific literature. Their case influenced public health policy throughout the rural South, leading to improved outreach programs for isolated communities and better education about the risks of consanguineous marriage. Medical schools began using the Blackwood case as a teaching tool, helping new doctors understand both the genetic mechanisms of inbreeding and the social factors that could lead to such extreme isolation. The case also highlighted the importance of cultural sensitivity in medical intervention, demonstrating that even well-intentioned efforts could fail if they did not take into account the beliefs and fears of the communities being served. By 1970, most of the surviving Blackwood family members had successfully integrated into mainstream society to the extent that their disabilities allowed. Some required lifelong care in specialized institutions, but others achieved remarkable independence and fulfillment. Several married outside partners and had children who showed dramatically reduced rates of genetic abnormalities, proving that the family's genetic legacy could be overcome in just a single generation of outbreeding. Martha herself became something of an advocate for people with disabilities and for isolated rural communities. Despite her own physical limitations, she worked with social service agencies to identify and assist other families who might be living in conditions similar to those she had escaped. Her unique perspective, as someone who had experienced both extreme isolation and successful integration, made her particularly effective at building trust with suspicious mountain communities. In 1975, Martha married a man she met through her advocacy work, a social worker named David Mitchell who had been inspired by her story to dedicate his career to helping isolated rural families. Despite doctors' warnings about the risks associated with her genetic heritage, Martha and David decided to have children. Their 2 daughters were born healthy and normal, finally breaking the cycle of genetic damage that had plagued the Blackwood family for generations. The abandoned Blackwood property gradually returned to nature. By 1980, little remained of the buildings where so much human drama had unfolded. The cleared fields had grown over with young trees, the fences had rotted away, and the paths that had once connected. The scattered cabins were barely visible beneath the undergrowth, but the memory of what had happened in that hidden valley lived on. Local historians preserved the story, and the site became a pilgrimage destination for medical professionals, genetic counselors, and others interested in understanding the extremes of human experience. In 1985, the Winston County Historical Society erected a small memorial at the entrance to what had once been the Blackwood property. The inscription read, "In memory of the Blackwood family who lived on this land from 1879 to 1958. Their experiences taught us about the importance of human connection, the dangers of isolation, and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. May their suffering not have been in vain, and may their stories serve as a reminder that all people deserve access to medical care, education, and the opportunity to reach their full potential as members of the human community." Dr. Thompson continued to follow the descendants of the Blackwood family until his retirement in 1990. His final report, published just before his death in 1995, documented the remarkable recovery that had occurred in just 2 generations of genetic diversification. Of the 67 known descendants of the original Blackwood family, fewer than 15% showed any signs of the genetic abnormalities that had once been universal in the clan. The Blackwood case, Thompson wrote in his final analysis, demonstrates both the fragility and the resilience of human genetics. A few generations of isolation and inbreeding created devastating consequences that might have seemed irreversible. But just 2 generations of genetic diversity were sufficient to largely overcome centuries of accumulated genetic damage. This recovery gives us hope for other isolated populations around the world who may be suffering from similar problems. It also reminds us of the fundamental importance of genetic diversity in human populations. We are all stronger when we remain connected to the broader human community, and we all suffer when we allow ourselves to become isolated from our fellow human beings. Perhaps the most fitting epilogue to the Blackwood story came in 2000, when Martha Blackwood Mitchell, then 59 years old, was invited to speak at a medical conference commemorating the discovery of her family 43 years earlier. Standing before an audience of doctors, genetic counselors, and public health officials, Martha delivered a speech that captured both the horror and the hope of her family's extraordinary journey. "When I was 16 years old," she began, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words, "I believed that the world ended at the edge of our mountain valley. I had never seen a car, never heard a radio, never met anyone who wasn't related to me by blood. I thought that the suffering I saw around me every day, children born with twisted bodies, adults who could barely speak or think, babies who died before their first birthdays, was normal. I thought it was God's will. I was wrong about many things in those days, but I was especially wrong about God's will. I don't believe any divine power wants children to suffer needlessly, families to live in isolation and fear, or human potential to be wasted through ignorance and superstition. What happened to my family was not holy or blessed. It was a tragedy that could have been prevented with knowledge, compassion, and connection to the broader human community. But I also want you to understand that the people who maintained these harmful practices were not evil. My grandfather Elijah, who enforced the isolation that caused so much suffering, truly believed he was protecting his family from a corrupt and dangerous world. The family elders who arranged marriages between close relatives genuinely thought they were preserving something pure and sacred. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong, but they were motivated by love and religious conviction, not malice. This is why education and outreach are so important in preventing tragedies like ours. People need to understand not just the risks of genetic isolation, but also the benefits of diversity and connection. They need to see that the outside world, while certainly not perfect, offers opportunities for healing, growth, and fulfillment that simply cannot exist in isolation. I have been blessed to live two very different lives. For 16 years, I lived in a world of suffering, limitation, and fear. For the past 43 years, I have lived in a world of possibility, healing, and hope. I have raised healthy children, contributed to my community, and experienced joys that I could never have imagined during my childhood on the mountain. But I carry with me always the memory of those who were not as fortunate as I was. I think of my cousins who died as infants, their tiny bodies unable to cope with the genetic burden they inherited. I think of my aunts and uncles who lived their entire lives with severe disabilities that could have been prevented. I think of the children who were never born, the talents that were never developed, the contributions that were never made to the human community. These losses remind me why your work is so important. Every isolated family you reach, every genetic counseling session you provide, every public health program you implement has the potential to prevent suffering and save lives. You have the power to ensure that no other family endures what mine endured. But I also want to remind you to approach this work with compassion and humility. The families you encounter may be suspicious of outsiders, resistant to change, and convinced that their traditional ways are best. They may seem backward or ignorant to you. Please remember that they are human beings with fears, hopes, and dignity that deserve respect. When Dr. Harrington first came to our mountain, he could have approached us with condescension or disgust. Instead, he treated us with kindness and respect, even as he worked to help us understand the need for change. His approach made all the difference in our willingness to accept help and embrace new possibilities. I hope that my family's story will continue to serve as both a warning and an inspiration. A warning about the dangers of isolation and the importance of genetic diversity. An inspiration about the power of human resilience and the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest circumstances. We are all part of the same human family, connected by bonds that are deeper than blood or geography. When we isolate ourselves from that family, we all suffer. When we embrace our connections to each other, we all benefit. This is the most important lesson I learned from my journey from a hidden valley in Alabama to this podium today. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your commitment to preventing other families from experiencing the tragedy that befell mine. The standing ovation that followed Martha's speech lasted nearly 5 minutes. Many in the audience were moved to tears by her eloquent testimony to the power of human resilience and the importance of their professional mission. Her words were recorded and transcribed, becoming one of the most frequently cited first-person accounts in the genetic counseling literature. After the conference, Martha was approached by dozens of medical professionals who wanted to learn more about her experiences and her insights into working with isolated communities. Her perspective as someone who had lived on both sides of the isolation divide made her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between medical professionals and the families they sought to help. In 2002, Martha published a memoir titled Beyond the Mountain, A Journey from Isolation to Hope. The book became required reading in many medical and social work programs, not just for its scientific insights, but for its powerful demonstration of the human capacity for growth and change. The memoir also revealed previously unknown details about life within the Blackwood family. Martha wrote about the complex social hierarchies that had developed within the isolated community, the informal care networks that allowed severely disabled family members to survive, and the subtle forms of resistance that some family members had maintained even under Elijah's authoritarian rule. One of the most poignant chapters in the memoir dealt with Martha's relationship with her own mother, Sarah Blackwood, who had been both victim and perpetrator of the family's harmful practices. Sarah had been forced into marriage with her own cousin at age 14, had borne 6 children with severe genetic abnormalities, and had lived her entire life accepting that such suffering was divinely ordained. My mother was a woman of tremendous strength and compassion, Martha wrote, but also a woman trapped by circumstances she could not control or even fully understand. She loved her children fiercely, but she had no knowledge of genetics or medicine that would have allowed her to prevent our suffering. She accepted our conditions as God's will because she had no other framework for understanding what was happening to our family. When I finally escaped the mountain and learned about the medical realities of our situation, I felt anger at my mother and the other adults who had perpetuated the practices that caused so much pain. But as I grew older and wiser, I came to understand that they were victims just as much as we children were. They had been denied education, isolated from medical care, and indoctrinated with beliefs that prevented them from seeking help even when it became available. My mother died in 1978, 20 years after I left the mountain. She had spent her final years in a nursing home in Birmingham, receiving medical care for the first time in her life. Despite her severe intellectual disabilities, she had learned to read at a basic level and had developed friendships with other residents and staff members. In her final months, she told me repeatedly how proud she was that I had found a way to break free from our family's tragic legacy. I didn't know there was another way to live, she said to me shortly before her death. I did what I thought was right, but I was wrong. I'm glad you were brave enough to find a better path. Those words meant more to me than any medical degree or professional recognition ever could. Martha's memoir also addressed the ongoing challenges faced by Blackwood descendants and other survivors of extreme genetic isolation. While the physical effects of inbreeding could be largely overcome in a single generation of outbreeding, the psychological and social effects often persisted much longer. Many former Blackwood family members struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression related to their childhood experiences. Some had difficulty forming healthy relationships, having grown up in a family system where the normal boundaries between different types of relationships had been completely erased. Others battled feelings of shame and inadequacy that stemmed from a lifetime of being told they were different, strange, or blessed with divine suffering. Recovery from extreme isolation is not just a medical process, Martha wrote. It's also a psychological, social, and spiritual journey that can take decades to complete. Those of us who survived have had to essentially rebuild our understanding of what it means to be human, what constitutes a healthy relationship, and how to function in a world that operates according to completely different rules than the one we grew up. Some of my relatives never fully completed this journey. They remained institutionalized or dependent on others for the rest of their lives, not necessarily because of their genetic disabilities, but because the psychological damage of their early experiences was too severe to overcome. Others, like myself, were able to adapt and even thrive, but we all carry scars that will never fully heal. This is why prevention is so much more important than treatment when it comes to genetic isolation. Once the damage is done, once children are born with severe disabilities, once families become trapped in cycles of harmful practices, once communities become completely cut off from the resources they need, recovery is possible, but extremely difficult and often incomplete. The best treatment for genetic isolation is to prevent it from occurring in the first place, through education, outreach, and maintaining connections between rural communities and the broader society. By the time Martha published her memoir, the original Blackwood property had been completely reclaimed by nature. The last visible traces of the buildings had been obscured by undergrowth, and even the cleared fields had returned to forest. Hikers who ventured into the remote valley sometimes stumbled across fragments of pottery or rusted tools, but these artifacts provided little indication of the human drama that had unfolded there for nearly 8 decades. However, the scientific legacy of the Blackwood case continued to influence medical practice and research. The detailed genetic data collected by Thompson and his colleagues had contributed to the development of new screening tests for hereditary diseases, improved genetic counseling protocols, and better understanding of how environmental factors could exacerbate genetic predispositions. Medical schools throughout the South continued to use the Blackwood case study as a teaching tool, not just for genetics courses, but also for classes on medical ethics, cultural competency, and public health. The case raised important questions about the balance between respecting cultural autonomy and protecting human welfare, the responsibilities of medical professionals when they encounter harmful traditional practices, and the challenges of providing care to populations that may be suspicious or resistant to outside intervention. In 2007, 50 years after the initial discovery of the Blackwood family, the University of Alabama Medical School hosted a symposium examining the long-term implications of the case. The event brought together geneticists, public health officials, social workers, and ethicists to discuss what lessons could be drawn from the Blackwood experience and how those lessons could be applied to current challenges in rural healthcare and genetic counseling. One of the key presentations at the symposium was delivered by Dr. Michael Thompson, Walter Thompson's son, who had inherited his father's research files and continued to follow the Blackwood descendants. His presentation, titled 3 Generations Later, Long-Term Outcomes in the Blackwood Case, provided a comprehensive overview of how the family members and their descendants had fared in the 50 years since their rescue from isolation. Of the original 35 Blackwood family members who had been living on the mountain property in 1957, only 3 were still alive by 2007. Martha, now 66, remained active in disability advocacy and public speaking. Her cousin Samuel, the young man with severe physical deformities who had demonstrated remarkable musical abilities, had spent most of his adult life in a specialized care facility, but had achieved some recognition as a folk musician, recording several albums of traditional Appalachian songs that he had learned during his childhood on the mountain. The third survivor was Rebecca Blackwood Peters, who had been just 7 years old when the family was evacuated. Rebecca had been among the most successful at integrating into mainstream society, eventually earning a college degree and working as a special education teacher for 30 years before her retirement. Her own children and grandchildren showed no signs of the genetic abnormalities that had once defined the Blackwood lineage. The remarkable thing about the Blackwood descendants, Dr. Thompson told the symposium audience, is not just that they overcame their genetic heritage, but that many of them have used their experiences to help others facing similar challenges. Martha's advocacy work, Samuel's music, Rebecca's teaching career. These accomplishments represent the transformation of suffering into service, of personal tragedy into public good. This transformation didn't happen automatically. It required tremendous courage, hard work, and support from dedicated professionals and caring communities. But it demonstrates that even the most severe forms of genetic and social isolation can be overcome with proper intervention and adequate resources. The Blackwood case also reminds us that genetic diversity is not just a scientific abstraction, but a fundamental requirement for human flourishing. When we allow populations to become isolated, whether by geography, culture, or prejudice, we all suffer the consequences. When we work to maintain connections and promote understanding between different communities, we all benefit from the resulting diversity and richness of human experience. The symposium also featured a presentation by Dr. Lisa Chen, a geneticist who had used the Blackwood data to develop new screening protocols for detecting the early signs of genetic isolation in small populations. Her work had led to the identification of several other isolated communities in Appalachia and other rural regions that were beginning to show similar patterns of genetic abnormalities. The Blackwood case taught us what to look for, Dr. Chen explained. We now know that genetic isolation doesn't develop overnight. It's a gradual process that can be detected and interrupted before it reaches the extreme levels we saw in the Blackwood family. By monitoring marriage patterns, tracking health outcomes, and providing genetic counseling to at-risk communities, we can prevent future tragedies while still respecting cultural traditions and community autonomy. We've identified more than 20 communities in the southeastern United States that show early warning signs of genetic isolation. In each case, we've been able to work with community leaders to implement educational programs and provide resources that help people make informed decisions about marriage and family planning. The results have been encouraging. We've seen significant reductions in the rates of genetic abnormalities without forcing communities to abandon their traditional ways of life. The symposium concluded with a panel discussion featuring Martha Mitchell, Rebecca Peters, and several other descendants of isolated mountain communities who had successfully integrated into mainstream society. The panelists shared their experiences and offered advice to medical professionals working with similar populations. The most important thing is to approach these communities with respect and humility, Martha told the audience. Don't assume that people are ignorant or backward just because they live differently than you do. Many isolated communities have developed sophisticated systems for survival and mutual support that could teach us all something about human resilience and cooperation. At the same time, don't romanticize isolation or assume that traditional practices are always beneficial just because they're old. Some traditions, like the genetic isolation that affected my family, cause real harm and need to be changed. The key is to work with communities to help them distinguish between traditions that serve them well and practices that cause suffering. Most importantly, remember that change takes time. My family had been isolated for nearly 80 years when Dr. Harrington first arrived at our property. It would have been unrealistic to expect us to immediately abandon everything we believed and embrace a completely different way of life. The fact that any of us were able to adapt at all is a testament to the patience and persistence of the professionals who worked with us. If you encounter families or communities that seem resistant to help, don't give up. Sometimes it takes years to build the trust necessary for effective intervention. But once that trust is established, the results can be transformative, not just for the people you're trying to help, but for yourselves as well. I know that Dr. Harrington and Dr. Thompson both said that their work with our family was among the most meaningful of their entire careers. In 2010, Martha Mitchell was diagnosed with cancer, likely related to the genetic abnormalities she had inherited from her family's long history of inbreeding. She faced her illness with the same courage and determination that had characterized her entire life, using her final months to complete a second book, a practical guide for medical professionals working with isolated communities. The book, titled Building Bridges, A Survivor's Guide to Working with Isolated Populations, was published posthumously in 2011 and quickly became a standard reference in the field of genetic counseling. It combined Martha's personal insights with practical advice from the medical professionals who had worked with the Blackwood family, creating a comprehensive resource for anyone facing similar challenges. Martha died in January 2011 at the age of 69, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, healthy, educated people who represented the complete transformation of the Blackwood legacy. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched through her advocacy work, including many medical professionals who credited her with teaching them how to approach their work with greater compassion and cultural sensitivity. Dr. Rebecca Peters delivered the eulogy at Martha's funeral, speaking about her cousin's remarkable journey from a hidden mountain valley to becoming a nationally recognized advocate for genetic health and disability rights. Martha could have spent her life as a victim, Rebecca said. She had every excuse to be bitter about the circumstances of her birth, the suffering she endured, the opportunities that were denied to her during her childhood. Instead, she chose to become a force for positive change, using her experiences to prevent others from enduring similar hardships. She often said that her greatest achievement was not surviving her childhood or adapting to life in the modern world, but breaking the cycle of genetic damage that had plagued our family for generations. Her children and grandchildren will grow up healthy and free, able to pursue their dreams without the burden of genetic abnormalities or social isolation. That transformation from suffering to hope, from isolation to connection, from tragedy to triumph, is Martha's true legacy. In the years following Martha's death, her work was continued by the Martha Mitchell Foundation, established by her family to promote genetic education and support isolated rural communities. The foundation has funded numerous research projects, educational programs, and outreach initiatives aimed at preventing genetic isolation and providing support to families affected by hereditary diseases. One of the foundation's most successful initiatives has been the development of mobile genetic counseling clinics that travel to remote, rural areas, providing screening, education, and counseling services to communities that might otherwise have limited access to such resources. These clinics have identified and helped dozens of at-risk families, preventing potential tragedies while respecting community values and traditions. The foundation has also funded the preservation of the Blackwood family's story through oral history projects, documentary films, and educational materials. While the original property has returned to wilderness, the family's experiences continue to serve as a powerful teaching tool for new generations of medical professionals and public health workers. In 2017, 60 years after the discovery of the Blackwood family, the Winston County Historical Society unveiled an expanded memorial at the site of their former property. The new memorial includes a small visitor center with exhibits about the family's history, the science of genetics, and the importance of genetic diversity in human populations. The memorial is designed not as a curiosity or tourist attraction, but as an educational resource and a place of reflection. Visitors can learn about the scientific principles involved in genetic isolation, the social factors that can lead to harmful traditional practices, and the possibilities for positive change even in seemingly hopeless situations. The centerpiece of the memorial is a quote from Martha Mitchell's final speech, delivered just months before her death. "We are all part of the same human family, connected by bonds that are deeper than blood or geography. When we isolate ourselves from that family, we all suffer. When we embrace our connections to each other, we all benefit." These words serve as both a summary of the Blackwood family's tragic history and a hopeful vision for humanity's future. A future in which no family will have to endure the suffering that the Blackwoods experienced, and in which all people can benefit from the rich diversity of human experience and genetic heritage. Today, the descendants of the Blackwood family are fully integrated into American society. They work as teachers, nurses, mechanics, and business people. They serve in the military, participate in their communities, and raise healthy families of their own. Few of their neighbors know about their unique genetic heritage or the remarkable journey that brought their families from isolation to integration. But the story of the Blackwoods lives on in the medical literature, in the classrooms where future health professionals learn about the importance of genetic diversity, and in the mobile clinics that travel to remote communities carrying the message that no family has to suffer in isolation. It's a story that reminds us of both the fragility and the resilience of human life, and of our responsibility to care for one another, regardless of the barriers that might separate us. In the end, the most remarkable thing about the Blackwood family may not be the extent of their genetic abnormalities or the severity of their isolation, but their ultimate triumph over these circumstances. From the depths of suffering and ignorance, they found a path to healing and hope. From complete isolation, they discovered connection and community. From a legacy of genetic damage, they created a future of health and possibility. Their story reminds us that no situation is completely hopeless, no isolation is absolute, and no genetic heritage is immutable. With knowledge, compassion, and determination, even the most tragic circumstances can be transformed into opportunities for growth, healing, and service to others. The hidden valley in Alabama, where the Blackwoods once lived, has returned to silence and wilderness, but the echoes of their story continue to resonate wherever people work, to prevent suffering, promote understanding, and build bridges between isolated communities and the broader human family. In that ongoing work, the legacy of the Blackwood family lives on, transformed from a tale of tragedy into a source of hope and inspiration for all who encounter it. Closing call to action. Thank you for joining us today for this fictional tale of the Blackwood family. While their story is imagined, it draws from very real scientific and historical knowledge about genetic isolation and its effects on human populations. Stories like this remind us of the importance of connection, diversity, and compassion in our shared human experience. If you enjoyed this deep dive into America's hidden history of isolation and resilience, make sure to subscribe to Holloway Archives for more forgotten tales that explore the darker corners of our past. Leave a comment below letting us know what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from mystery enthusiasts across the country who appreciate these complex stories of human triumph and tragedy. And remember, while this story is fiction, the scientific principles and human experiences it describes are very real. The work of genetic counselors, public health professionals, and rural healthcare providers continues today, helping to ensure that no real family will ever have to endure the isolation and suffering that befell our fictional Blackwoods. Until next time, keep exploring the hidden corners of American history with Holloway Archives.